Sam and I always had a lot of affection for one another, or at least I did for you. I don't know how you felt about me. And then our paths kind of did this through time. And I think maybe like 10 years ago or so, I was living in Avalon, he was living in Avalon, basically 2 streets apart. Really loved the guy. I have to say, he came to my house about once in the 3 years I lived there. And we were just so busy, you know, we had a couple of kids, me too, and heaps of other projects going on. And always knew you were in the fashion world. And then later I just saw you and like, what the hell's he doing over here in Seaforest? So we're going to hopefully get to dive into your story a little bit today. So if we maybe start at the beginning, something that stood out for me when we first started hanging out was your passion for fashion, but also for sustainability. And I think fashion's like the 2nd or 3rd biggest polluter in the world. And you can kind of understand why, because everyone has multiple items of clothing. It's a very intensive thing to produce cotton and then to get it in different parts of the world and dye it and do all these things. So you were kind of recognizing a lot of the issues with fashion. And then what were you doing with your brands at the time to try and, because you stood out, you were one of the first that was sort of in that space trying to innovate.
Yeah, there was, obviously the industry's come a long way now, and there are things like the Sustainable Apparel Coalition and things like the Higg Index, which now benchmarks all brands, I think, on an even keel. Also, you know, as a consumer, you have more awareness into the supply chain than we ever did back then. In those days, it really came about through, having a first-hand or witnessing, aspects of the supply chain, cotton farmers in India and the huge amount of pesticides that was being used at the time, those same local waterways being used to bathe in and drink. People were getting sick on a regular basis. The tanning of hides, the sweatshops were overpopulated, full of people making clothes, and we as consumers at the time, and still somewhat, when we walk past stores in the street, we see a beautiful garment, but you don't really get the backstory of how that garment was made. And I felt certainly that something had to be done, firstly to bring a little bit more information to consumers about the supply chain, and also in doing so, demonstrating how we could do things differently, which meant developing relationships with primary producers. They had to put people in our business that a lot of other brands at the time didn't have to do, and that created complications. I wasn't an expert in logistics or in procurement of cotton, and we're working with mills. The other thing, we began working with some really innovative textile companies that were making things like fibres out of waste milk. Proteins, and we were doing things like making sequin dresses out of recycled plastic bottles, and really early circular ideas around how we could create better products. And it was really exciting, but it was disruptive and it was different, and it was difficult, I think, as a brand with purpose, to get that message communicated to the audience. We had quite a successful global network of retailers that stocked our garments, but our products were more expensive. And they were more expensive because there was all sorts of complications within the supply chain, and we had to put people in the business, and things cost more when they're made slowly. But it was a really exciting journey.
So that's one of the issues with fast fashion, right?
Yeah.
Stuff's made cheaply and doesn't last particularly long, so you need to continually buy it.
Correct.
Yeah. I remember one time you went to China and you told me, and I was just so unaware of this fact, but you said you were going to some villages where people there had never seen the stars, and that just stuck with me, that idea of not being able to see the heavenly bodies.
It's really amazing. Yeah, I mean, the amount of pollution, and I think that's part of, I guess, where I'm at now is in relation to sort of climate change, and that increasing carbon concentration in our atmosphere is created through industry, and there's whole cities and towns in some of these places that, like you said, Gary, they don't see the stars. It's just, and I know that there was an interesting documentary made through COVID, how it was interesting how industry slowed down, and therefore, the sky opened up again and people were able to see the stars for the first time in a long time. So if there was any positive out of it, that might have been one of them.
Yeah. So how did you go from fashion to where you are now? Because I know you kind of moonlight for a little while doing photography and creative direction for a couple of different brands. So how did you manage to fall into doing what you're doing now, and what are you doing now, so Phil can know?
Yeah, sure. So the co-founder of a company called Seaforest, where we grow seaweed down in Tasmania. We have one of the first marine farms of seaweed in Australia. And that seaweed is, when harvest, is used as a livestock feed supplement. So we feed it to cattle and it stops methane. And so methane, it's important because methane is the second most abundant gas in our atmosphere after carbon dioxide, and livestock and the burps, more so than the farts, are responsible for making up about 15% of global anthropogenic greenhouse gas emissions and about 75% of agricultural emissions. So the little seaweed that we grow, that was discovered by the CSIRO, wipes out about 98% of the methane when fed as 0.2% of the animal's diet, so a tiny amount. But, so that's a big pivot, as you say, Gary, and how that came about was I'm a member of the Climate Council, and I was tuning in to a webinar that they were hosting, and it was Professor Tim Flannery was talking about he was basically distilling down an IPCC report that had come out. So the UN's Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change creates these reports every year, and they've been doing so for a really long time. And basically there's a huge group of scientists that get together and they talk about what are the changes that are happening, and they also project forward in terms of what we can expect to see if we don't reduce emissions. And there were some graphs, in particular, whenever you see an exponential graph, things get pretty scary. And we were, sharing, increased rate of extreme weather or severe weather events. Many of these things that we've now sort of experienced. We had the bushfires, we've had massive floods. We are now living in that world which the climate scientists have predicted for a long time. But at that time, it was about 2017, and I was listening to Tim, and it's hard, and it's very common that we all start to feel a bit anxious when we hear about climate change, because it's such a huge issue. We're talking about gigatons of carbon in our atmosphere and industries that are far greater than that we have any control over. And how do we as one individual actually make an impact? So sure, we're concerned about climate change, but what the hell can you do about it? And so I, just on a personal level, began thinking, well, we've got to do something. And as a parent and a father, it was clear to me that as part of the communication that I was listening to from the Climate Council, that it's not about our generation, it's actually about the future generations on this planet that are going to really see the consequences of our actions today and actions of generations before us. And so I began looking into what were possible solutions outside of, solar energy, which seems to be, being adopted across the country at the time. And I found out about seaweed. And, seaweed was really interesting to me because as someone who grew up in the ocean and loving surfing, and have always felt a strong affinity to it, and also the fact that this was almost like horticulture in a way. We were talking about marine plants that grow, and it seemed far less complicated than nanotechnology or capturing carbon out of the air and printing carbon. It was less tech-driven and felt like something that we needed to commercialise. So I just began, through Google and through reading lots of research papers and listening to YouTube and having conversations, picking up the phone and calling scientists and just trying to learn as much as I could about this possible solution. And I learned through the journey that even though seaweed's like an $11 billion industry globally, and there's so much seaweed that's cultivated each year, there's only about 9 species of seaweed that we grow. And of those 9 species, most of them are Northern Hemisphere endemic, and we're forbidden from growing non-endemic species of seaweed for good reason in our oceans. So we can't grow things that you would eat at the Japanese restaurant, like Poropa, which is what nori's made out of, is Northern Hemisphere endemic. So we had to find, and part of the journey, if we were to pursue this as a solution in Australia, we had to find markets for Australian native seaweeds. And so it's just really through research, Gaz, that I would learn something and then I would go this way and that way, and it's, different rabbit warrens, and just keeping a curious mind and open to the learning. And eventually I stumbled on the work that was happening at the CSIRO, where there were two scientists, a ruminant, a cattle digestive scientist, and then a seaweed scientist came together, and they had this idea of feeding 30 different varieties of seaweed to cows to see the impact that might have on their burps. And seaweeds have really quite interesting compounds and things that they make from the ocean that we don't get in terrestrial plants. And so they were looking for nature-based solutions to climate change, and this was one of the seaweeds stood out. There's a native seaweed called Asparagopsis. It's a red seaweed that we have. It's quite seasonal in this area, but we do find it every year. It's all around Australia and New Zealand. And when they fed just a tiny amount of it, they found that it knocked out the methane, which is just amazing. But at the time, they used divers off the barrier reef to get the seaweed. There was no commercial supply and no one knew how to grow it. And so I thought sounds like a really good problem to try and solve as someone from the fashion industry.
Wow. So take us through, how did you begin Seaforest? Did you found it by yourself? Did you just kick it all off? You would have had to have obviously raised a lot of funds to do it. It's a very ambitious project. Work us through that.
So, as a concept, first of all, when I learned about the seaweed and the work that was happening at the CSIRO, I picked up the phone and I called them and I said, "Tell me about this work that you're doing. I'm really fascinated." And the guy at the time said, "If you could figure out how to grow it, there's a huge market for this. So, it's worth giving it a shot." And I thought, well, I don't know anything about seaweed, so who do I need to call? And they said, call this guy, Professor Rocky Denise, who's the head of aquaculture at James Cook University. He was the guy that introduced all these different seaweeds. So I called him, and he was so generous with his time. He and I began to develop a relationship where I would call him. He would spend, an overgenerous amount of time on the phone with me, for an hour and a half or 2 hours on a Friday afternoon. And then when we'd finish that phone call, my inbox would ping with peer-reviewed published literature. So I'd be reading all this research over the weekend, and then I'd have more questions for him next week. And we went on this almost like this mentorship, I guess. But he had his day job, and he wasn't paid by us or me at the time. And then along the journey, so very much the ambition was to develop Seaforest, even though it didn't have a name then, and I didn't know where we were going to grow it. It's already kind of momentum had started to build. And then I was introduced by a mutual friend to a guy called Stephen Turner, who has a strong finance background and had built a lot of companies from, greenfield startups to sort of London Stock Exchange listed companies. He was a little bit older than me, but he has a wealth of experience, and also he has young children or a young daughter, and so he has this shared concern for climate change. And we caught up a few times and had discussions, and he tells the story that the person that introduced us said, "You've got to go and meet Sam, and if you meet him, I swear you guys will start a business together." And so that's more or less what happened in a relatively short period of time. So we started Seaforest, and we bootstrapped the company for the first 2 years almost. So we had to develop a method for growing. It was impossible to raise capital to build the business or do anything further beyond the science. So I think one thing to be aware of, and I was also not fully aware of at the beginning, is just how complicated seaweed science is, or seaweed's life cycles are. Our seaweed in particular has 3 life phases. So it is a life phase where there are male and female plants, and male germinates the female, and she produces offspring that look nothing like the parents. So they're like 2 humans giving birth to a koala or something. And so then that koala or that other life phase, then it's like almost like reincarnation or something. It's really crazy, but that then asexually reproduces, and then it will form back into male and female plants, which settle onto a substrate and then begin to grow. We had to undertake an amazing journey, I guess, of sort of nature-based science, observing nature, understanding how these, under what environmental triggers or what environmental cues triggered reproduction. And we couldn't do anything in terms of growing the seaweed until we solved that science. So you have to be able to develop cultivation methodologies. And so we did that. We got the support of Rocky. We engaged 3 universities that were experts in this space. And then we had our own small research team. And we would meet weekly. And so we figured out what our knowledge base was. We figured out also where the gaps were. And then we divided. We were like, you guys do this, you guys do this. And then we would meet each week. And we made really amazing progress in a short period of time. And then over that 12-month period, we developed methods for cultivation. We were able to then go and raise money to actually build a farm. And so we've raised... it's all in the public domain, but we raised $5 million to be able to develop land-based ponds and hatchery and processing facilities. And then we've raised, after that, we developed a method for the first time and through COVID, the ability to grow the seaweed in the ocean. And then we were able to secure one of the largest marine leases in the Southern Hemisphere, where we had to establish that lease, which means putting infrastructure out there. It was previously used as a mussel lease, and so we had to repurpose some of that infrastructure, but we raised $35 million just 12 months later, and have established about a third of that lease, and are now growing lots and lots of seaweed and supplying cattle. It's been a really exciting journey. And also it's been like anything else too, in a way. As our business has grown, we have around 44 employees now down in Tasmania, across science and engineering and marine farming, processing, office administration and things. And you have the same, trying to be efficient use of time and making sure everybody's meeting milestones and to budget and all these things. So we have the same challenges as lots of businesses, but it's just this remarkable new space. We're building a kind of a new industry for Australia, which is really exciting.
So what's the vision for Seaforest?
Is to move the needle on emissions reduction. So we have a landscape now where Meat and Livestock Australia, which is a industry body, has set a 2030 carbon neutral target, and there's no way they'll possibly get there. That's about 55 million tonnes. Well, I shouldn't say that there's no way they'll get there. There's no other solution that comes close to the seaweed in order to be able to deliver that outcome. We have 26 million cows in Australia, but we have about 1 billion on the planet. They produce around 3 billion tonnes of CO2 equivalent per annum, and so we've got a really big job to do. And so I think for success for Seaforest would be I think through our existing assets, we can produce enough seaweed to reduce 5.6 million tonnes of carbon dioxide from being produced each year. But part of that is, is convincing farmers and some, meeting people with where they are with regards to climate change. Also, they have to pay for the product, so they also have to incur an expense, and then they're looking through their supply chain at how they might be able to retract that cost. So there's some complex. And we're also developing carbon credits I should say we are registering a carbon project under the international Vera standard, where we can get farmers access to carbon credits, which is also then comes as a bit of a subsidy for you using the product.
Yeah, because the seaweed seems to do two things. It sequesters, but it also is an antidote to the production of the methane in the animals.
Right.
Yeah,
seaweed's part of the reason why we're so excited about seaweed in the first place was that seaweeds, unlike land-based plants, they're what we call zero input crop. So they don't rely on finite resources like fresh water. They don't need pesticides or fertilizers, and they're just everything they need to grow is in the ocean and up in the sky. And so because they're unlike trees, I guess, or whose leaves photosynthesize and the roots absorb the nutrients and the trunk really just stores the carbon. With seaweed being immersed in the ocean, the entire organism is always photosynthesizing, and so they have the capacity to grow up to 30 times faster than land-based plants. So we have through photosynthesis, they're also capturing carbon and oxygenating the water. And why that's important is because our oceans have increased in acidity by 26% in the last 3 decades. We see, particularly in Tasmania, the warming East Australian current is having an impact. And so marine plants serve to, at a particular scale, can stabilise ocean health.
Mm. And what makes Tasmania the perfect place to do what you're doing?
Well, firstly, it's the temperate marine environment where there's an abundance of different seaweeds. It's not well understood, but in Australia we're one of the most biodiverse places in the planet for seaweed. There's about 14,000 recorded species, and there are more here in Australia than anywhere else. And yet it's interesting that we don't have an seaweed aquaculture industry. And so for us, Tasmania was a site where, of the seaweed that we grow, there is a temperate and tropical variety, and we grow the temperate variety down in Tasmania, and we grow it in an area where it was wild and annually abundant. And so if you were to go snorkeling any time before we came along, you would see this seaweed everywhere. And so for us, it felt like a low risk way of being a location for us to start. And also there's an aquaculture industry down there, so in order to get people who had marine farming experience to run the boats and do things, and they also have an amazing university down there, so there's lots of reasons to go to Tasmania. But we are looking now at replicating what we've done in Tasmania in other places.
The timing seems to be perfect for it, right? If you started to do this 10 years ago, it would have been a big flop, but now climate change is a theme,
It's true, it is true. And also the biggest challenge would have been trying to convince farmers to adopt the product. And in particular, 10 years ago, that would have been one of our biggest challenges.
How are they going with the idea?
It's been awesome, but we've had some challenges depending on the type of company. But what we found is that there are pressures on the industry, but what those pressures are dependent on what type of company we're dealing with. So, for example, we've got one large pastoral company that's a public company. They've got shareholder pressure, and they've made a commitment, and so they need to report reductions based on that commitment that they've made to the market and to the shareholders. And they've got the sustainability report and ESG goals. There are other farmers, like there's a family-owned dairy farm that we work with in Tasmania, and his daughters are coming through to start taking over the farm, and they're getting increasingly involved, and they did all of the baseline emissions calculations for the farm, and they're driving as the next generation that will take over the farm wanting to do better. And so those types of farms are fantastic to be working with, innovative and progressive farmers. And then there's another guy who we're working with in Tasmania who's a merino wool farmer, and he's in his 70s, and he's a 3rd or 4th generation wool farmer, and he wants to leave the world, his farm, a better place than he found it. And so it's about his legacy. And so different people are meeting this challenge from different places, but we definitely feel that there's a shift. And I think this year will be really exciting for us to be able to start to see more farmers adopt and the emissions from agriculture come down in Australia.
Is there any governmental support? Because it seems like you've raised funds all independently of them.
We have received government funding, so for different reasons. So part of it was we received $1 million from the government to establish the marine farm, to help establish that marine farm. We've also had to, in those early days, develop some of the science. So we've received some support from the government there too. But it's all through the grant programs that they've got out. They're all competitive. We submit, and we either win or we don't.
Yeah. And are there other parts of the world that are starting to reach out to you guys, seeing what you're achieving?
The government world? Or?
No, just like in general. Like, are there other places? Because I think it was in Canada where the guy first discovered that cows were eating seaweed, and it was like affecting their methane levels, but it was also helping them actually be healthier.
Yeah, that's right. So seaweed you can get, and even for human health, they've got really interesting, not only chemistry, but also nutritional profiles. So we can get lots of trace minerals from seaweed that you can't get from terrestrial plants, things like selenium, zinc, iodine, of course, which is important for cognitive function. And so, there are a variety of seaweeds that are being used for livestock feed. One particular seaweed, which is like the golden kelp, has been used for dairy as a natural remedy for dairy cows with mastitis. You feed it to them, and they have these complex carbohydrates called polysaccharides, and they're amazing anti-inflammatories. It's like looking to nature to find the solutions. And it's interesting, we also have a seaweed that we're growing. So we're growing now about 8 different varieties of seaweed, all native to Australia. But one of the seaweeds that we grow has these complex carbohydrates that have been used in cancer patients undergoing chemotherapy, and it reduces the inflammation of their organs. So it's like a co-treatment. And so, in a way, sort of replacing the need for pharmaceuticals, but it's not patentable, So there's, lots of... And then I guess the other thing that's been really interesting is how, we talk about beef and dairy cows, but those animals, unlike cars, forgive me if anyone's sensitive to this, but they go, unlike cars where there's thousands of components come together and make one product, a cow ends up going 150 different directions. And so we've been contacted by, interesting, we had a call with Gucci where they're talking about the leather that they use in their product and how they take on board as Scope 3 emissions about 6% of the cow's methane. We've had, obviously MJ Bale has been producing net zero knits and carbon neutral suits from the wool, as well as dairy companies like Fonterra of creating, a carbon neutral butter product or aggregating that milk into their supply chain. So there's lots of, it's been interesting for us. I guess I underestimated how complex that whole supply chain is.
Can you explain to us how someone achieves carbon neutrality?
So,
how does someone who's producing wool, making nets, how does someone like that go about doing it? They have to obviously offsetting it somehow.
No, yeah. So there is offsets for sure. So you can offset. So you would undertake what's called a life cycle assessment, or an LCA, and so someone would come in, a third party, and they would audit basically your footprint, and they'll go through everything from cars you drive to the flights you take to the amount of energy you're drawing from the grid. And then you get given a sort of a carbon footprint. And then from there, there's measures that you can take under the emissions reduction fund that will enable you to reduce that footprint. So in our case, if you feed your cows the seaweed, then that reduces the methane, and then you can report against that, and that reduces your footprint. But it's interesting because it doesn't deliver carbon neutrality. And it's a good point that you bring up, because... And it's a part of the reason why, as a company, we're trying to focus on livestock companies or livestock producers that are values aligned somewhat, because you have to have other activities. So whether it be through increasing the soil carbon or regenerating forests on your property. Our sheep farmer, for example, that we work with in Tasmania, he has a Charlie Massey regenerative agriculture project, and he's already carbon positive. And so adding the seaweed just offsets the transportation of that wool to Italy and back. And so therefore he has that kind of carbon neutrality. But it's not a silver bullet. We need a multitude of solutions to create the outcomes we need.
And I'm sure everyone's seen a lot of documentaries. There's been a host of them. The 11th Hour was one that was quite striking, and then there were Al Gore's, obviously, and then there was What the Health, and the one before that, Cowspiracy. And so that documentary seemed to highlight, first of all, the agricultural issue. And then I watched one recently for the second time, because I didn't realise I'd watched it until I was about 3/4 of the way through. But it was Planet of the Humans. And that wasn't, for those of you who have seen that, it's probably not worth watching unless you can see past the limitations in that documentary, because it seemed to just discredit everything. We're all aware of the greenwashing that tends to happen. These brands make all these claims that their products are carbon neutral or whatever it may be, or they're made of recycled this or 50% that. But you don't have to look too deeply into what they're doing and realise it's kind of quite fraudulent. So this particular documentary was focusing on like solar and gas and looking at, is it really the solution to our problem? Have you you've dived much into the solar thing, and what are your thoughts on solar?
I mean, there's all sorts of nanometals and things we continue to have to mine in order to be able to continue to sustain solar energy. I do think that a transition from coal, oil and gas is what we need. We do need to create the resilience necessary to support or to avoid the kind of things that we've seen just recently on the east coast of Australia. We've had power outages and things because of the lack of supply of energy to the grid. So renewable energy is important. I do also think it's worth mentioning that we have to start somewhere, and I also think from Seaforest standpoint, we're developing, everything we do is brand new, and it's both really exciting and it's scary, and it's we have to learn with an open mind and also be as aware as possible of our impact, of the activities that we do, because there's very little on the planet that you can do without having an impact. But I swear to God, whoever comes after us will do a far better job because we existed in some way. And I do think that it has been true in any technology. The third iteration or the fourth iteration is far better than the first. And I think I try to be positive about these things, but I do respect that there are individuals and companies that take the whole system for granted. It's part of the reason why I think the federal government and all of, with all of its flaws, created the emissions reduction fund. And the idea is that there are methodologies that have been developed under the Clean Energy Regulator that then allow farmers to access carbon credits, which then give them the climate active stamp on their product. And that goes through a rigorous auditing process, which gives you slightly more credibility, a lot more credibility than just being able to make a claim to the market. And I think it relates a little bit back to my fashion industry days, where that term sustainability was relatively new term back in 2004, 2006 when I was doing Elsom, to then being just such an overused word that as a consumer, so how do you even know what sustainability means anymore? It's such a to be truly sustainable means to tackle a problem from so many different directions. You can be sustainable from using organic cotton, sure, but then there's still the human impact of using sweatshops in Bangladesh. There's just lots and lots of components that go into making something truly sustainable. And so it's important that there's some kind of independent body, and hopefully that's being operated without any sort of intervention or fraud, to be able to give consumers what they need in terms of the true impact of how that product's being made.
So when you look at your personal journey, are you able to connect the dots, often like Steve Jobs says? When you look back later, you see why all these things that you experience, all these skills you developed, how they became useful?
Yeah, in a way. I think connecting the dots. I think...
Because what I see, when I look at you in fashion, you're very innovative, very different, thinking outside the square, ahead of your time in terms of what you're wanting to create in your vision. And the market just wasn't ready to meet you. And then I see what you're doing now. You're innovating, pushing the boundaries again, and fashion is relentless. That's just if you want to develop resilience, just start a fashion brand. It's grueling. And I watched you for many years, just in the ring with it. So it seems like, is this industry more difficult, or do you find it's a breeze because of all of the rough times you went through with setting up your own businesses previously?
Yeah, that's absolutely true what you said about the fashion industry. I think it definitely breeds resilience. If anyone that's had any experience in that industry, they would know. But I also think this has just been so exciting. So definitely supply chain disruption, being curious. I'm learning, and we are all learning at Seaforest every day. And when one of our scientific team has a breakthrough, it's like the first time this stuff's ever happened in the world, and so it's really quite rewarding and super exciting. But also, I feel like my role in the company has been to sort of bring amazing people together. So we've got now Professor Rocky Denise, who was the head of aquaculture at James Cook University, is now Seaforest chief scientist. The guy who was the ruminant digestion expert, who also did the animal trials, is now head of agriculture for Seaforest. And so we've got this amazing team who don't need my input really to achieve amazing things. What I think I've been able to do is just bring, a mix of just incredibly capable people together who are now inspiring the next generation of scientists and marine farmers, and we're all, rising as a result. So it's interesting. It's lots of learning, but I don't know how important an ingredient I am anymore. I'm not sure.
And what's been your favourite moment or moments, some of the stories that have come along the way that stand out for you from the inception?
For me personally, it was, I'm undertaking this huge risky journey with a new business in a new industry. And there wasn't really anyone to follow at the time. There was limited travel. You couldn't go and see seaweed farms in other parts of the world. And so what I found myself doing was in Tasmania was going swimming every day, and I would go and snorkel on or just free dive on these kelp forests, and you would see how the natural biodiversity, the seasonality of the seaweeds, and you would start to just immerse yourself in what nature's doing and how is it operating, and and you would just see things you would notice, and that would be sort of how I was at the beginning of my sort of learning journey in Tasmania of the seaweed. So that was really something that was really rewarding personally. And also there's it's almost like companion crops. Like there's seaweeds that just grow together. They just like being next to each other, and they, you don't only see this from getting underwater and snorkeling. So that's been amazing. Also, I think when we first started the business, we were told that you could never grow the seaweed in the ocean, and that wouldn't be viable or wouldn't be possible. And then, it was only because COVID hit, the university shut down, we had to keep trying to find ways to produce seaweed. And so we put the seaweed in the ocean. We managed to seed lines, and then they grew. And, we hadn't seen what was happening underwater. And one day we got a guy from Hobart to come out with an underwater drone, like an ROV, which he operated from the boat, and he brought back this video footage, and it's the seaweeds just alive underwater, and it was such an amazing time to see that all that work had been quite successful, and that was super important.
What a moment.
Yeah.
And so is there other people in the world that are growing it in the sea, or are they doing it in like those like basins or tanks?
Yeah, there are other companies in the world. So as I mentioned earlier on, so there's two companies in Hawaii that are working out of the same sort of shared aquaculture research facility. So they're growing it in tanks. And so whilst, as I mentioned, it's non-endemic, but it does happen to occur. So through ships and logistics and things, seaweeds have been carried to different locations and have recruited and are now part of the ecosystem. But then because they're not native, you can't grow them in the ocean. So these guys are growing it on land in Hawaii. There's a company that's growing a small amount of seaweed in Sweden using the emissions from a paper mill or something like that. But it's really, they have to heat the water because it's so cold. They also have issues because I think they spend like 3 months of the year in the dark. So, but there are people, trying to innovate to get this solution out there. Yeah.
So you guys potentially could become one of the biggest producers in the world.
Yeah, I think that's possible. But also I think what we want to do is to use the science and IP that we've developed and help the entire industry get better.
Yeah. Will you do open source like Tesla does with these batteries, or like Stone and Wood do with their brewery?
We could do that. I don't think we've really settled on exactly how. I think So this is when you sort of take off your environmental hat and you put on your sort of commercial hat, and you say, well, we've invested so much money, and we've just at the beginning of commercialization now. If we were to open source everything, whilst it would be good for the planet, it might put us at a competitive disadvantage. So the way we're thinking about that at the moment is potentially, a licensing agreement or something where there's an acknowledgement that we've transferred our IP, and that they can go ahead and create their own business.
Do you patent the technologies?
Yeah, we have patented.
Okay.
There's about 5 patents that we've developed across, the life cycle closure and lots of biology, right through to the manufacturing process of processing it into a state.
And so, it's always weighing up that balance, isn't it? Like the environment that you want to heal, the commercial aspect. We have the same thing here. It's like every business has that arm wrestle. Otherwise, you're a charity.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, I do believe, built Seaforest to try to be a company of tomorrow that thinks differently about, capitalism and operates differently commercially. But, we still have to, and out of respect for also our scientists that have, there are people thinking about this at midnight on Saturday night that are on our staff, that are really absolutely dedicated to finding solutions. So, out of respect for them, I think it's also worth acknowledging the IP that's been developed.
Yeah. I've also heard that when you look at methane and the problem of methane and the problem of like carbon dioxide, they're two very different things. Like it said that the carbon sits in the atmosphere for 100 years, whereas methane, it disappears pretty quickly. So that's why they're saying if we were to stop agricultural production tomorrow, you would notice a dramatic change in the environment quite quickly, which I guess potentially happened in within COVID in some respects. So it makes sense that if you can do something which reduces methane emissions by 98%, it's almost like that's like an incredible huge discovery for humanity, because it seems people aren't willing to transition away from their eating habits.
Yes, in fact, it's interesting because in Australia and maybe in the east and west coast of America, people are eating less meat, but as a global population, we're eating more beef and meat than ever before, and so that number continues to rise. And so I think we'd probably have a good chance at avoiding 1.5 degrees of warming if we all stopped, if that industry just went away completely. But at the same time, that's not a realistic thing to expect to have happen. The other thing is just to talk about methane very quickly. It has 28 times the warming impact. So at the UN COP26 last year in Glasgow, they were talking about, particularly focused on methane, because we've been talking about these 1.5 degrees of warming from pre-industrial levels, and we're trying to avoid that by 2030. And the IPCC has brought out many reports showing what we need to do in order to be able to deliver that outcome. And we're failing or falling short of what we need to do. If the reason why they pointed out methane is because it's short-lived. So if we stop producing so much of it, then actually we have a chance within the next 10 years for whatever's existing in the atmosphere to no longer be there, and then also to stop producing more of it, because it's just such a potent greenhouse gas with that 28 times global warming potential. It actually just to understand that as a gas, they benchmark it against carbon dioxide over 100 years. So it has the equivalent of 28 times the warming impact over 100 years, even though it lives in the atmosphere only for a short period of time. But it has about 82 times the warming impact over that short 10 years. So it's actually really quite a potent greenhouse gas. So
has it always been the case, or is it because the diets of the cows have been modified away from what they would naturally eat that the problem's been exacerbated, or I'm not sure?
It does change depending on the diet of the animals. So what we've found, or what I've learned through starting Seaforest and learning a little bit about the agricultural sector, is that high cellulose diet, cattle up in Northern Territory and northwest Queensland produce more methane than, say, they do in Gippsland.
Mm-hmm. Because of being fed like soy and corn and things like that.
Well, not so much actually. It's interesting that grain-fed cattle produce slightly less methane. So it's just I've spoken to people who say that these animals that are, because of their four stomachs, they can break down cellulose, so low quality pasture, and turn it into meat, turn it into protein like no other animal can do. They can take these, the pastures of this rugged terrain and turn it into beef where you couldn't run any other animals or any other type of agriculture. But also, I guess it's just important to note that as a company, Seaforest, we're not advocating for people to eat meat or drink milk or even for the industry broadly. What we're trying to solve is an issue of emissions reduction, which is urgently needed. And as I mentioned earlier, if we could try to really drive adoption and get those emissions down, then we can have a meaningful impact. We can have some hope, I think, at trying to avoid that 1.5 degrees of warming.
And what's the biggest challenge for uptake from people in the industry? Is it awareness? Is it the price? What is it?
A couple of things. So I think the price predominantly. The price, and then that there's no government policy. Like no one has to do this. It would be a voluntary commitment that they would make to reducing their emissions. And some companies are doing it, but others are sort of like, well, if I'm not made to do it, why would I bother? And I think also the thing about any agricultural, like any farmer really would understand that there are cycles with, even though we have a warming planet, and they're all starting to become increasingly aware of the higher frequency of extreme weather events and so forth that would impact them directly, whether it be through floods or droughts. Farmers, particularly the older ones, have lived through these types of times. At the moment, farmers are having a great time in the country, but it only takes 3 years, and all of a sudden we're in a drought again, and things are hard. So I guess they're just a bit cautious about the cost. The subsidy technically would be the carbon credit, but interestingly in Australia they haven't developed a carbon credit for feed supplements. So last year Angus Taylor had the opportunity to prioritise method development for feed additives and didn't do it. So this year we're hoping that they will prioritise feed supplements for method development, which will give our farmers in Australia access to carbon credits under the ERF. At the moment, we rely on the voluntary carbon market, which is the Vera standard out of Europe. So there's some work to do locally, for sure. And I think one of the things here, and when I talk to the industry bodies and farmers, it's like, this is an Australian science created by Australia's peak science body that is developing a new industry that it's environmentally positive in providing jobs, education in a remote part of Tasmania, and that's then helping to decarbonise Australian agriculture. And not everybody in the world has this opportunity because this is a native seaweed to Australia. So we have I think we have 1,800 hectares of marine space. It's one of the largest marine leases in the Southern Hemisphere, and we've got around that an option for a further 3,500 hectares. It's more than all the marine space in New Zealand combined. The marine leases, and so we have an industry scale solution, and I just think that this is a really great Australian story, but we're trying to get farmers to adopt it's an
epic story.
Yeah.
I don't know if it's just me, it's amazing. This kind of reminds me of one of those companies like Apple or Microsoft just being in the garage starting its thing, and then suddenly the whole world, because it is a massive problem, so why wouldn't the world want to access what you guys are doing? It just seems like it's a matter of time.
Yeah, there's a lot of people around the world. I think, just broadly, not just in this space, but there's never been a time in the world, I think, where there's more companies are looking at climate tech or some solutions, whether they're nature-based or otherwise, to deliver emissions reduction outcomes. So it is an exciting time, and I think that there is momentum in terms of, as consumers, for us to make wise choices and be educated around, how things are produced, and making sure that we're making choices that are rewarding companies that are doing more in that space. But also now, I guess, as when we're eating, it's just this meat is not available at the moment. But if we were to eat meat, that we should, there is a solution. So if there's something carbon neutral and they've not produced methane through the process, we have a lot of power as consumers to create the change just through our own spending habits.
And do you get visionary sometimes and just think what the world could become? What do you see the world looking like in 10 years?
Yeah, I sometimes think about this in the context of my children. I think about the future industries and what skills they might need in this new world, fast forward sort of 20 years or 40 years. And I do think that... I do think there's going to be huge disruption. I think a lot of these technologies will improve, and I think that we will. I'd like to see. I think there's probably, for me personally, there's what might actually happen, and then what I'd like to see happen. And I think I really believe in. That we need to produce better food. We can't keep, we are well outside of our planetary boundaries on so many levels. And, we need to really think about the food that we're consuming, or the way that the way that these companies are making our produce, and the lack of nutrients as a result of, trying to just grow more food faster. Something has to break at some point. So there's lots and lots of systems, I think, that are broken, that require someone to put their energy into, and there needs to be a revolution on many fronts, and I'd love to see that sort of thing realised. I don't have the answers though.
Still finding them, still discovering them.
Very, yeah.
So you personally, what are the major things that you've learned about yourself and about life through this journey? Have there been key things that have come up for you that you wouldn't have otherwise learned without going on this journey?
So we talked about the resiliency of the fashion industry, and that was important. I also think my world since starting Seaforest has got super busy. There's just so many complicated things that we're working on. It's very diverse, and I think for me, learning to meditate actually is one of the most important things in my life. It's been a way of accessing the North Star and just checking in that with myself and my body and how I'm going, but also, as we make decisions, are we still on the right track? Because you're making decisions based on commercial outcomes or environmental outcomes, but are we still at the same place, in terms of where we started or why we started, into purpose? And so for me, meditation's been the breath work, the meditation has been one of the most important things, and
it's amazing.
Definitely, without a doubt. And I even feel like sometimes when I have times where I'm not meditating as frequently, I still am being carried by the momentum that was created.
And what's it like, because you live up this way now and you're in Tassie a lot, you've got a couple of kids, you've got a wife. How do you balance all of that?
It's hard. I think, for my family, I'm away most of the time. Like, I spend quite a lot of my time in Tasmania. And I wouldn't be able to do it without the support of my wife, and also my kids understand why we're building this company and why it's important. But there's a reality behind that I'm not around as much as I would like to in some really important years. My kids are 9 and 11, and they mean everything to me. And that is a genuine juggle. I don't think there's a perfect answer, but I think if I was working in an office job, I was away from 9 to 5 and I lived locally and I was there at dinner time or whatever, I think probably I'd be in a similar situation, still juggling. Like, I think all of us at times juggle, the pressures of life, or trying to keep everybody happy.
Okay. open it up to you guys now. Anyone got some questions? Yeah.
What are your end seaweed products? What products are you actually going to sell?
Yep. So we sell a seaweed product in a variety of different ways. So depends on what the farmer. So if it's a feedlot, for example, let's say at the moment the product only works if you've got cattle, that if the farmer has access to the animals every day, because they need to get that supplement every day. So extensive grazing systems like we see in northern parts of Australia, we don't have a solution for at the moment, but we're working on lick blocks for that. So we'll incorporate our product into a lick block, which has mineral supplements and molasses and salt and things in it. And so that will be a product we'll sell. We're also developing pellets, which we're feeding to the sheep. And then we were able to create an oil extract, so like an oil supplement for the cattle, which is included into what's called a total mix ration. So in a feedlot, they've got many different ingredients that are all going together to create a ration, and that oil forms part of it. So we're trying to work with farmers and the infrastructure that they've got, or the feeding regimes that are already in place, to be able to kind of fit into that.
And what about human products?
So we've got, this is something that I'm super excited about, is that there's some amazing native seaweeds that we know nothing about. And as I mentioned earlier, we're one of the most biodiverse places on the planet. And, we've discovered, well, we haven't discovered them, but certainly I've come across seaweeds that they're almost like, one of them is called Ketamorpha. It's like a string of iridescent green pearls, almost like salmon roe, but they're iridescent and green, and they're all joined together. And you pop them in your mouth, and they've got this fresh cucumber flavour. It's just so distinct. And these things are native to Australia. It's like just remarkable. And so we can grow this. We're also doing some work with Macrocystis, which is the giant kelp. So in addition to growing the seaweed that we're doing for Seaforest for the livestock feed, we've also had our scientists apply their knowledge and expertise to the closing of the life cycle of the giant kelp. So outside of, you can eat that kelp, it's really tasty, sort of like kombu, and has, again, all of those trace minerals and things that we can get from and they've also got a gelling agent. So we probably don't realise that we come across seaweeds in most days of our life, because it's in our toothpaste, it's in paint, it's in yogurt, and it's sort of like similar to gelatin, only it doesn't set. It's like just a thickening or gelling agent, and so that's quite common. But the Macrocystis, which is actually the fastest growing plant on the planet, it also happens to be in Australia an endangered species. Because of the warming East Australian current and also unregulated harvesting of that seaweed for the alginate, 97% of the giant kelp forests around Tasmania have been wiped out. And so we, again, exploring the life history of the seaweed, we then got our scientists to mimic what happens in nature, and we've been able to breed. So we go diving in these environments where there are more temperature resilient. So in the heat of summer, when the water temperature is at its highest, you can notice that strands of seaweed will be surviving. And so we take those tissues from those seaweeds and you're able to reproduce them. And then we provided the University of Tasmania scientists 250,000 little propagules grown onto, like little 10 centimetre plants that were grown on top of stones. And they then used to repopulate an entire giant kelp underwater forest, which is amazing. And so over a short period of time, those seaweeds grew to the surface, and ultimately what it does is it creates a canopy of the forest and then allows all this other abundant life to grow and be supported underneath. So it's sort of, kind of like being under here.
Amazing.
So this year we're hoping to do more. We're actually undertaking the first forest scale restoration efforts in the Southern Hemisphere. So it's a new sort of frontier of conservation, and it's super exciting. And again,
so
all
exciting.
Requires science, this nature-based science, asking questions of nature and trying to, observe and be present and then, create and collaborate to create positive outcomes.
Regarding fertiliser, I normally sprinkle spirulina in my plants and everything comes back to life. It's a completely natural and healthy fertiliser. Does seaweed have healing properties as well? Have you been looking at this? Because obviously there'll be fertilising issues even with seaweed in our sick climate.
Yeah, so there's lots of seaweed that's created for fertilizers, and your friends at Seasol, they collect the seaweed off the beach. They have a permit to collect it after a big storm, and that was sort of the nature of the seaweed industry before we came along, but they are powerful because they're high in nitrogen and phosphorus, which is what plants need to fertilize or to grow. And so we're growing, we have a parallel approach to cultivation. So we're growing the seaweed on our large marine lease, but we've also bought, just last November, a former abalone farm. So like a redundant asset industrial waterfront site with 660 swimming pools that were already made for growing abalone. And we're now repurposing that into a land-based seaweed farm.
Amazing.
And that's just 35 minutes up the road from our initial land-based site. And some of that seaweed, we've looked at using for fertilizers, but it's a really low value product. So we're not a Southeast Asian operation where wages are very low, but I think we've been looking at we've provided some of our seaweed to a company in WA called Ulu that's been creating plastics, bioplastics. We've also looked at creating paper alternatives. So there's lots of exciting things, bioacetates as well for sunglasses, like all of these things that use petrochemicals, and so to try and find alternatives. But I think for us, the fertilizers are like a very low cost product, but yes, we have the ability to do that. The seaweeds get all of the nitrogen and the phosphorus from the ocean in which it's abundant.
Amazing. Yeah.
Thanks for sharing your story. It's been incredibly inspiring, especially about the giant kelp. That's what I wanted to ask you about. I've been reading about multi-solving for people and the planet on Dumbo Feather. Elizabeth Sawing developed the idea of multi-solving, which focuses on solutions that address the climate emergency while also improving health, well-being, equity, and economic vitality. It's a really cool concept, and I think it's the same thing you're doing with seaweed, because one solution can really solve so many problems. What do you think the next big things are outside of the seaweed space?
I think it's looking at. So we definitely need to stop relying on coal, oil, and gas. Lots of our plastic is a byproduct of biopolymers. Energy's huge. The creation of energy. So I think we'll be looking at, rethinking our grids, maybe microgrids where, battery innovation, I think, has a long way to go still. I think that there's, for me personally, if I was looking at what problems do we need to solve now, I think I'd look at things like plastic. We just don't need plastic anymore on the planet, and if there's some way to create plastic alternatives at a low cost, then that would be something worth pursuing, particularly if it has a nature as a source material. I don't know if that effectively answers your question, but
I often think whoever solves the plastic problem is going to be the wealthiest company on the planet, and should be, because it is such an issue. Just the waste, and everything we have is touched by plastic, in some way. All our groceries, and it's astonishing. Who else got questions? Yeah.
Have you looked into the aspect of seaweed species? Like with spirulina, there are so many different ways to utilize it. Have you looked into all the other possibilities?
That's right. And there's, for us, we've got to be careful not to get distracted, because you're right, there are so many possibilities, and we're at the forefront of something that's entirely new. Obviously, there's edible seaweeds. We've been working with chefs, so at the moment we need to figure out, how much of this product do people need. We've got to also then figure out what's its shelf life, how do we store it, how do we optimize its flavour. Spirulina that you mentioned, that's actually not a macroalgae, it's a microalgae. So it's like it grows on land in ponds generally in Europe. And so because they use fresh water and they have a different way of producing it that's higher in protein. So seaweeds generally have around 30% protein maximum. And so it's interesting, actually, is that, you know, you were talking earlier about how we create our products. It's less likely that this will be a human food, but we, when we extract out, so this seaweed and why it's special is because it's of the 14,000 species, it's the only one that has this cell structure where it has tiny little gland cells inside it, where these little golden sacs that synthesize all these different compounds just from the ocean. And we're able to, a lot of those are what we call lipid soluble, and we're able to get them out into the product, which we can then sell, but then we can be left with, you know, the carbon and also some of these sulfated galactans, you know, which is like a complex carbohydrate that can be used. It's an immunostimulant, so it boosts your immune system. And so that we've got a byproduct or a waste stream that has high protein and, you know, these complex carbohydrates that could be used for human or animal health. And so we're looking at, you know, how do we extract them? What can we do? And so there's, you know, avenues there for kind of bioceuticals and holistic foods. We've been thinking, because it's an industrial sort of it is sort of an industrial process, but it's because we're working with livestock feed. We thought probably a likely pathway would be to feed it to pets, you know, as like a pet food inclusion to help, or to horses or something like that. But it's possible that we could extract those compounds and turn them into something that we could ingest, or a powder or something that you could mix in your smoothie.
You mentioned the struggle with the industry and the cost being really high. Is there any solution to bring down the cost? Do you see a solution for that?
Yep. Okay, that's a great question. So when we started, the cost of the product was about $3 a head per day or something like that, which is really expensive, right? And but everything when you start and you're small, like the costs are enormous. We've managed to get that down to 1/3 of that, which is still quite high, but we've been working with industry to try and reduce that cost, and you know, guided by what they think it needs to be. We've had, you know, where we've got to a point where, with the inclusion of, or the accessing carbon credits, and something really important I didn't mention actually is the way in which the seaweed works in the rumen. So cattle, as I mentioned, they have 4 stomachs. One of them is like a huge gas chamber, which is where all the methane is created. And methane is produced by these animals through enteric fermentation. It's like the way they digest food, and methane is a byproduct. But methane as a molecule or a compound, it's carbon and 4 hydrogens. Now the rumen is abundant with hydrogen, but the carbon comes from the food that they eat, the pasture. And so that carbon that's attached to those 4 hydrogens is a waste of feed efficiency. And so about 20% of that energy is lost because we're our intensive production programs. And so through it basically what the seaweed does is improves feed efficiency, and you get more growth per kilogram of dry matter intake per day. And so that carbon, the way our seaweed works is it stops the hydrogens attaching to the carbon, it disrupts the enzymatic pathway that would lead to methane, and it converts or redirects that carbon into energy, or turns into like a short chain fatty acid, which it uses to grow. So farmers actually have this fundamental productivity gain that underpins the economics. So about 68% of the cost is taken up by the productivity gain that they achieve. And then the other sort of there's about 26%, I think, that's taken up by the carbon credit. So the cost is almost negligible. Well, the cost of the planet for doing nothing is significant. So I think, yeah, and this is based on today's carbon price, and if they, yeah, yep. But you know, it's interesting that there are other things. So around the world today, there is, EU's introducing climate tariffs. So carbon intensive products getting exported to Europe will get a tariff put on it. So that's a cost. In New Zealand, they're talking about a burp tax. You know, if you don't do something, you're going to, you know, in Ireland, they're talking about culling numbers of cattle so that they can meet their emissions target. So around the world, things are happening and there's pressures on the industry. So what's the cost to play? And I think whatever it is now, that sort of 10 cents a day is probably worthwhile.
I guess differentiation in the market is the key, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
It's amazing. And the first thing that goes to market is always like exponentially more expensive than what comes in second, third, fifth, sixth generation. I mean, we only have to look at motor cars, we only have to look at like computers, and we only have to look at like the first time anyone, came up with some technology. You compare it to original price to what it is today. Everything, as you go to scale, reduces down significantly. So, yeah. So as you guys go to scale, you would naturally see that your ability to produce without having to create more infrastructure. I mean, you're in a massive building phase, but once you get to a sort of level, then it's like anything, like in fashion. You make your money in fashion once you do a lot of volume, and you spend a lot of money to get to those levels, building all the systems and all those relationships and the infrastructure. And then after maybe 3, 4, 5 years, you're able to actually get profit as an organisation or as a fashion label.
Yeah, that's right. I think in the same economies of scale are true here. You know, we have a fairly linear process, and we've got the infrastructure out. The seaweed grows on lines. We have significantly reduced the cost of production. We've got around 100 kilometres, I think, of crop on the farm at the moment, and that has helped to bring the cost down. This, maybe hopefully through land-based farming, we've actually, which I didn't speak much about, but so land-based farming relies on water from the ocean, which comes in, is filtered and populates around the pond, gets all the carbon and nutrients the seaweed needs to grow through that process. We grow a different life phase on land. It's important to note. So it just fragments and photosynthesizes and grows. But we can control the amount of nutrients and carbon that it gets by increasing the flow of water. And so basically helping to facilitate faster growth. And by shading or increasing the light, we can then control the conditions that the seaweed under which it's growing. And therefore what we've been able to achieve is almost a 6-fold increase in the concentration of bioactives inside those gland cells from land-based farming. So this is just not manipulation, but it does sort of, by changing the parameters of the bioavailability of carbon and nitrogen and sunlight.
Thanks for coming and sharing your story. I want to finish just with a couple of questions.
Of course.
Just random questions, totally unrelated to what we've been talking about.
Great.
Yeah. What's your favourite colour?
Probably like denim blue.
What's your most cherished childhood memory?
Sleeping in my board bag on the beach when I was like 12 or something.
And who has had the biggest impact on your life and why?
There's been a few people. I think it's fair to say you've been one of them, Gaz, honestly. My mother as well has been a huge impact and influence in my life. My sister, who's here as well. My children have being a father is an amazing experience for me. It really put everything in perspective and changed the way I view the world.
What's the biggest lesson your kids have taught you?
To not take things too seriously.
Yeah. They do that. Mine taught me that too. Still learning. And what is your wish for your kids?
That they can grow up in a world that has a future that they understand, that's known. I feel like a lot of children today growing up in a world where there's a lot of climate anxiety and there's a lot of uncertainty. And then, my son in particular, who's experienced the floods twice. There's an element of fear about what lies ahead. And, I'd really love for them to understand that, maybe if we've got a handle on emissions and if we can sort of feel like, change is inevitable and we have to get comfortable with change. But at least if they feel like there's some stability in the world.
Yeah. And if you could change one thing about humanity, what would that be?
What's the question? If I could change?
If you could change, yeah, if you had a power and you could shift something in the world, what would that be?
I think I would inject more love. I think love is one of the most important things, I think, on the planet. From the moment we're born, we're born with a full heart, and through life experience that's disrupted, and there's still so much hatred, whether it be through races or countries or religions, that divide people. I think we would be in a very different place if there was more love.
What's the best advice you've ever been given?
Breathe, I think. Yeah, I think so.
And if anyone, was sitting in their world at the moment, a little bit dissatisfied, perhaps with their position, whether it be with their health, with their job, with their relationships, what's your advice to people who are, not aligned, haven't found their dream yet?
So I would say just firstly check in on the feeling. I would say, sit, meditate, breathe, do something just to center yourself and find out where that's coming from. And then if we're talking about relationships or something, I mean, I'm not an expert, but I would say, from a place of at least understanding where these things come from, then you begin to, if you're wanting to make a change in your career, for example, get curious, start learning, and just be open to anything that falls on you, that might you find blissful and worth pursuing. Just be open and just stay curious, research, and then just take small steps. For me, the journey with Seaforest was, I was like, right, we've got to do something. We've got to get more climate solutions underway. These need to be commercialised, and we can't wait for government to do something about it. And so that's when I began researching seaweed. I thought, okay, I'm going to see if I can find a solution in seaweed to pursue. And then it's a sequence of tiny steps that eventually you're like, okay, now this is happening. And it's like, wasn't a one day where I made a decision and then Seaforest started and then everything happened. It's like just lots and lots and lots of tiny steps, and being open to where that path will take you, and along the way, just continue to stay curious and at times check in.
Great, man. Thanks for coming. Thanks for sharing your time and your knowledge. I feel like I know so much more about seaweed now. I was absolutely clueless.
Thank you. Thanks so much. Thanks.
And most of all, thanks for being part of the solution, because I feel that's the thing that is so overwhelming when the problem seems so great and the solution seems so fluid, but you've just actually stepped up and gone, no, I'm doing this, making it happen. So congratulations, man.
Thank you very much. And thanks heaps for having me today, Gaz. I think we could all agree that, just by breathing and meditating, it's like and in these environments, you're building community, having these conversations, it's really important. So thank you for having me today. Really appreciate it.